Sophia made it through the applause, the whispers, and Andrew's cruel toast with her head held high. But the moment she slipped through the side door into the empty hallway, her strength collapsed like a house of cards. The muffled music from the ballroom seeped under the door, mocking her with the sound of celebration. She pressed her back against the wall, clutching her chest as if her heart might shatter right there. Her vision blurred with tears. She had promised herself she wouldn't let Andrew see her cry again. Yet here she was, shaking, her breath shallow, the humiliation of the night crashing down like waves too powerful to resist. "Why did I come?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling. "Why did I think I could face him?" She staggered toward the restroom, pushing open the heavy door. Inside, the harsh light illuminated her pale reflection in the mirror. Mascara streaked her cheeks, her lips quivered, and for the first time in years she looked like the broken woman Andrew wanted her to be. Sophia gripped the sink, her knuckles white, trying to steady herself. Images flooded her mind: Andrew's smug grin, Vanessa's cruel laughter, the pity in the eyes of their old classmates. Every scar he had left on her spirit reopened at once. She saw herself in their marriage, waiting at home with dinner gone cold, listening to his excuses, apologizing for things she hadn't done wrong. She heard his voice echo in her head: "You're nothing without me, Sophia. No man will ever want you." Her knees buckled, and she slid to the tiled floor, curling into herself. The sobs came heavy and raw, the kind that tore from deep inside, the kind she had held back for far too long. She cried for the years she lost, for the dignity stripped from her, for the woman she had once been before Andrew broke her. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The sound of footsteps echoed as another woman entered the restroom. A classmate, someone Sophia vaguely remembered, paused with wide eyes. "Sophia, are you all right?" she asked softly. Sophia quickly wiped her tears and forced a shaky smile. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice hoarse. The woman gave her a sympathetic look but didn't press. After a moment she left, and Sophia was alone again. Alone with her shame, alone with her doubts, alone with the gnawing question: was Andrew right? Was she really nothing? She pulled herself back up to the mirror. Her reflection looked hollow, defeated. "Maybe I should just leave," she whispered. "Slip out before anyone notices. Let him win." The thought stung, but it felt easier than fighting. Easier than standing in that ballroom with his laughter echoing. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. A text from an unknown number glowed on the screen. "Don't let him break you. You are stronger than he will ever be." Sophia blinked, stunned. Who would send such a message? Her pulse quickened, a strange spark of hope flickering in her chest. Someone was watching. Someone cared. She stared at herself again, torn between collapse and defiance. Her hands trembled, but something deep inside whispered that this moment, this lowest point, was not the end of her story. It was the turning point. For now, though, she closed her eyes, letting one last tear fall. The night had wounded her, yes, but wounds, she remembered, could heal into scars that told stories of survival. And when she walked back into that ballroom, the woman Andrew thought he had destroyed would no longer be the one standing before him. Sophia stood in the restroom, her phone still glowing with the mysterious text. "Don't let him break you. You are stronger than he will ever be." Her heart pounded. Who could have sent it? No one knew how close she was to giving up. No one knew the storm inside her chest. Unless someone had been watching. She tucked the phone back into her clutch, wiped the last traces of tears from her cheeks, and straightened her posture. Her reflection still looked fragile, but there was a glimmer in her eyes, a hint of the fire she thought she had lost. She whispered to herself, "Not tonight. He won't win tonight." When she stepped back into the hallway, she expected silence. Instead, she froze. A man was standing at the far end, tall, broad-shouldered, his tailored suit cut with precision. His presence carried a quiet authority that made the air itself heavier. He wasn't looking at his phone or scanning the crowd like everyone else inside the ballroom. He was looking at her. Sophia's breath caught. It was Richard Hale. Most people in the city only knew his name in whispers. The elusive CEO of Hale Technologies, a company worth billions. He rarely appeared in public, avoiding the spotlight despite his influence. For Sophia, he was more than just a headline. He was the man who had walked into her life when she least expected it. The one who had asked her questions no one else had cared to ask. Their connection had grown quietly over the past year. Dinners where they laughed until midnight, conversations that healed wounds she thought permanent. He had never pushed her to reveal more than she was ready to share. But Sophia had kept one truth hidden from everyone. They were married. The ceremony had been private, away from the cameras, away from Andrew's shadow. Richard had respected her need for secrecy. He wanted her to feel strong on her own terms, not as someone's wife, not even his. And now, here he was, at the very reunion Andrew thought he controlled. Richard's gaze softened as he stepped toward her. "Sophia," he said quietly, his voice deep and steady, a stark contrast to the chaos in her heart. "You don't have to face this alone." Her throat tightened. "What are you doing here?" "I came because I knew he would try to hurt you tonight," Richard replied, "and I wasn't going to stand by and let that happen." He studied her trembling hands before gently taking one into his. "You are not the woman he left behind. You are more than he could ever deserve." For the first time that evening, Sophia felt her chest loosen. The pain was still there, but it no longer consumed her. Richard's words, his presence, reminded her that she had rebuilt her life on her own and that she wasn't powerless anymore. The hallway lights glimmered off his wedding band, a subtle reminder of the secret they had shared in private. Soon that secret would no longer be hidden. Inside the ballroom, laughter erupted again. Andrew's voice loud, arrogant, filling the air with poison. Sophia closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. When she opened them, she was no longer trembling. With Richard by her side, she felt steady, almost unshakable. She turned to him, her voice quiet but firm. "If he wants a show, then let's give him one." Richard's lips curved into the faintest smile. He squeezed her hand. "Then it's time they see who you really are." And with that, they walked back toward the ballroom doors, the weight of truth about to shatter Andrew's carefully staged humiliation. Because in a matter of moments, the world would learn that Sophia Lane was no victim. She was the wife of a millionaire CEO. The ballroom's double doors swung open again, but this time it wasn't Andrew or Vanessa commanding attention. It was Sophia. Minutes earlier, she had slipped away broken, her dignity torn apart under Andrew's cruel speech. Now, she returned different. Not in the sense of clothes, though Richard had quietly called for his driver to bring in a sleek black gown he had prepared just in case. The gown draped over Sophia's figure with elegance, catching the light like liquid silk. Her hair, once slightly undone from the tears she shed, was now pinned back with a simple diamond clip Richard had pressed into her hand. But the true transformation wasn't fabric or jewels. It was in her eyes. The timid, wounded Sophia who had endured Andrew's jabs for years was gone. In her place stood a woman who carried herself like she had nothing left to prove. Her shoulders were straight, her chin high, and her every step resonated with quiet power. Conversations faltered as heads turned. The jazz band seemed to lose its rhythm for a beat, the music dipping as if even the instruments recognized the shift. Andrew was mid-laugh, glass raised high when he noticed the change. His smirk froze. For a second, he didn't even recognize her. Vanessa clutched his arm tighter, her eyes narrowing with unease. Sophia crossed the ballroom with Richard at her side. His presence was commanding, but he didn't overshadow her. He simply walked beside her, letting her own radiance fill the room. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Is that Sophia? She looks incredible. Who's that man with her? Wait, isn't that Richard Hale?" The name rippled through the crowd like electricity. Some guests gasped, others leaned in closer, their curiosity sparking into awe. Richard Hale, the reclusive CEO, the man known for building one of the city's most powerful empires, was here, and he was holding Sophia Lane's hand. Andrew's face darkened. He forced a laugh, louder than before, trying to mask his panic. Well, look who decided to dress up," he sneered. But his voice cracked slightly, betraying him. Sophia stopped in the center of the ballroom, directly across from Andrew and Vanessa. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence that had fallen made every word ring clear. "You were right about one thing, Andrew," she said, her tone calm, steady. "Life is about moving forward, about growth, about choosing the right partner." She let her gaze drift briefly to Vanessa, then back to Andrew. "But what you never understood is that leaving cruelty behind is not loss, it's freedom." The crowd murmured, heads nodding, eyes fixed on her. Richard stepped forward slightly, his hand brushing Sophia's. "And freedom," he added, his deep voice carrying across the room, "allows people to rise higher than those who tried to bury them." Andrew's jaw tightened. Vanessa shifted uncomfortably, suddenly less radiant under the collective gaze of the room. Sophia took one more step closer, her voice still soft, but now edged with undeniable strength. "You thought I was nothing without you. But tonight, everyone sees the truth. I am not your shadow. I am not your failure. I am a woman who rebuilt herself and found a love you will never be capable of understanding." The room erupted in applause. Some guests cheered openly, others clapped quietly with tears in their eyes. Sophia stood taller, letting the sound wash over her. For the first time in years, she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't surviving. She was owning the moment. Andrew tried to sneer, tried to laugh it off, but his voice was drowned in the thunder of approval. And as Sophia stood in the spotlight, it became clear. The power had shifted, and the reunion was no longer Andrew's stage. It was hers. The applause still echoed through the ballroom when Andrew, desperate to regain control, stepped forward. His smile looked more like a grimace, his voice tight with forced bravado. "Impressive speech, Sophia," he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "But let's be honest, this transformation? It's just a costume. Underneath, you're still the same fragile woman who begged me not to leave. Everyone here remembers, don't they?" He looked around, hoping for support, but the crowd remained silent. Vanessa, sensing his grip slipping, chimed in with a sharp laugh. "Exactly. The new dress and a rich man don't erase the truth. Once weak, always weak." Sophia didn't flinch. Instead, she tilted her head, her eyes calm, almost pitying. "Funny, Andrew, you speak of truth, but maybe it's time everyone here hears the real truth." The room hushed. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Every eye turned toward her. Sophia took a slow breath, steady and deliberate before continuing. "You paint me as a failure," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly. "But do you remember the nights I worked double shifts tutoring students while you chased deals that never existed? Do you remember who paid our rent when your ventures collapsed? Do you remember whose savings you drained to fund your so-called investments?" Gasps rippled across the room. Andrew's face paled. He hadn't expected her to speak, much less reveal the past he had buried. Sophia stepped closer, her words cutting sharper. "You told everyone I was holding you back, but the truth is, I carried you for years. And when you found someone new, you didn't leave because I was weak. You left because you needed someone naive enough not to see through your lies." All eyes shifted to Vanessa, who stiffened, her painted smile faltering. Sophia reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone. With a few taps, she held it high for all to see. The screen lit up with emails, bank statements, evidence she had kept hidden. "Here's the truth," she said firmly. "Andrew Carter's business isn't thriving. It's drowning in debt. He owes more money than most of us will ever see in a lifetime. And the man who parades around as successful? He's one step away from bankruptcy." The room erupted in murmurs. Some classmates gasped, others whispered in disbelief. A few even shook their heads, muttering that it explained everything. The desperation, the bragging, the cruelty. Andrew lunged forward, his face red. "You don't know what you're talking about," he shouted. But the crack in his voice betrayed him. Sophia's gaze remained steady. "Oh, I know. And so will everyone else tomorrow when these records reach the public. Because people deserve to know what kind of man hides behind the mask." Vanessa pulled her hand away from Andrew's arm, her expression twisting in horror. "You told me you were expanding, that you had deals lined up," she hissed. "You said we were set for life." Andrew's composure finally shattered. "Shut up, Vanessa," he barked, but it was too late. The image he had so carefully crafted crumbled in front of everyone. Sophia didn't gloat. She simply turned to the crowd, her voice quiet but resolute. "For years, I let him define me. Tonight, I define myself. Not as his ex-wife, not as a victim, but as someone who survived him and came out stronger." The ballroom erupted in thunderous applause, louder than before, shaking the chandeliers. Guests clapped, cheered, even whistled, the sound drowning out Andrew's sputtering protests. Sophia lifted her, standing tall in the spotlight, and in that moment, Andrew Carter's reign of cruelty ended. Not with his triumph, but with his complete, public collapse. The ballroom roared with applause, but Sophia stood still, her calm presence commanding the room more than any noise. The woman who once hid behind lowered eyes now stood in the spotlight, radiant, unshaken. She let the clapping settle before she spoke again, her voice steady but warm, carrying to every corner of the hall. "I want to thank you all," she began, her eyes sweeping across the faces of old friends, classmates, and strangers alike. "Not for the applause, but for listening, for seeing me. For too long, I believed Andrew's lies, that I was weak, unworthy, a woman who had nothing without him. But tonight proves something I hope every woman in this room remembers. We are never defined by those who try to break us." A hush fell. Even the waiters paused, trays balanced mid-air, drawn in by her words. Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger. "Pain doesn't destroy us. Betrayal doesn't erase us. Every wound, every scar is proof of survival, and survival is the foundation of strength." Her words struck deep, rippling through the crowd. Several women nodded, some with tears glistening in their eyes. A few men shifted uncomfortably, reflecting on their own past actions. Andrew tried to interject, his voice hoarse. "This is ridiculous," but his protest was drowned by a chorus of shushes, classmates silencing him. Vanessa had already slipped away, her heels clattering as she stormed out, leaving Andrew to choke on the ruins of his pride. Richard stepped beside Sophia, his hand brushing hers in quiet solidarity. He didn't need to speak, his presence alone reinforced her words. The crowd recognized it instantly. The partnership built not on dominance, but respect. And that, more than money or power, was the true revelation of the night. Sophia turned slightly toward him, then back to the crowd. "I didn't find strength because I married a powerful man," she said firmly. "I found strength because I chose to stop believing the voice that told me I was nothing. I chose to rebuild. And I want every woman here to know, you can rebuild too. You can start over. You can rise." The ballroom erupted once more, but this time it wasn't just applause. It was cheers, whistles, shouts of her name. Sophia's chest swelled, not with pride alone, but with relief. For years she had lived under Andrew's shadow. Tonight, she had finally stepped into her own light. Andrew stood alone, red-faced, muttering to himself, ignored by the very people he once tried to impress. The final humiliation wasn't Sophia's tears, it was his irrelevance. No one cared about his protests anymore. His downfall was complete. Richard leaned close, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "You were extraordinary tonight," Sophia smiled softly. "No, Richard, I was finally myself." Together, they began walking toward the exit, hand in hand. The chandeliers sparkled above, casting golden light over their path. Guests moved aside, offering smiles, congratulations, even embraces. Sophia felt the warmth wash over her like sunlight breaking through years of storm clouds. At the doorway, she paused, turning back once more. Her eyes met the crowd, her voice lifting one last time. "Let tonight be a reminder. Women are not weak. We are not defined by abandonment or betrayal. We rise, we heal, and we reclaim our stories. Always." The final applause thundered through the ballroom, shaking the walls, echoing down the marble corridors long after Sophia and Richard stepped out into the night. Outside, the city lights glowed like 1,000 tiny promises. Sophia breathed deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt not broken, not surviving. She felt free. And as Richard's hand wrapped around hers, steady and sure, she knew her story was no longer one of loss, but of triumph. The ex-wife who had once been shamed had become the woman who rose above, and the world would never forget it. The chandeliers still glowed in the ballroom as Sophia and Richard stepped out into the crisp night air, but inside, Andrew's world was collapsing. The applause that had once been his fuel was now a weapon turned against him. He remained standing awkwardly in the center of the room, sweat beading at his temples, as whispers swirled around him like a storm he couldn't escape. "Bankrupt?" one voice hissed. "He lied about everything," another replied. "I knew something was off." Someone muttered, shaking their head. Andrew tried to salvage his image. He raised his glass again, his laugh brittle. "Don't believe her. She's bitter. None of it's true." But the room wasn't listening anymore. His classmates, once eager to orbit his arrogance, now stepped back, their eyes filled with judgment and disgust. One man from their graduating class, now a successful attorney, crossed his arms. "Funny, Andrew. If none of it's true, then why does your company's name keep popping up in lawsuits?" Gasps shot through the crowd. Andrew froze, unable to answer. Vanessa had already abandoned him, leaving a lipstick stain on the rim of her half-finished champagne glass. She had slipped out the side door, her phone already buzzing with frantic texts to friends, desperate to distance herself from the man whose empire was nothing but smoke. The sight of her empty seat beside him made Andrew's chest clench, not from heartbreak, but from the terrifying realization that even his mistress wouldn't stand by him now. The reunion, once his stage, had become his trial, and every eye was a jury condemning him. Meanwhile, Sophia and Richard walked slowly down the marble steps outside, the cool night air wrapping around them. For Sophia, every step away from the ballroom was a release. Her chest felt lighter, her breaths deeper. Yet behind the relief was an ache, a recognition that though she had won, her scars were still real. Richard seemed to sense it. He squeezed her hand gently. "Justice isn't always loud," he murmured. "But tonight, it was thunderous." Sophia smiled faintly. "I never thought I'd live to see him silenced." "Silence is just the beginning," Richard replied. Inside, Andrew's silence was indeed beginning to echo louder than his voice ever had. A group of classmates gathered near the exit, speaking loudly enough for him to hear. "I heard the investors already pulled out. Serves him right. He treated her like dirt for years." Andrew's skin burned. For the first time, he felt small, invisible, the same way he had once made Sophia feel. Only now there was no one to shield him, no one to soften the edges of his cruelty. He was alone. He stumbled out of the ballroom into the night, his breath sharp, his fists clenched. He searched the street for Vanessa, but she was gone. Only the laughter of strangers spilled from passing cars. He looked up at the glowing hotel sign and realized, with a pit in his stomach, that he had become exactly what he feared most: irrelevant. Back inside their waiting car, Sophia leaned against Richard, exhausted but steady. She glanced out the window, watching Andrew's figure shrink in the distance. For years she had imagined revenge as screaming, as shouting, as vengeance returned blow for blow. But tonight proved something different. Revenge was truth. Revenge was walking away whole while he crumbled in the ruins he built for himself. Richard touched her cheek gently, tilting her face toward him. "This is just chapter 1, Sophia. The next is yours to write without him." Sophia exhaled, a long cleansing breath. For the first time, the future didn't terrify her. It called to her. And as the car pulled away, leaving Andrew behind, she knew her story of healing had only just begun. The morning after the reunion, sunlight spilled through the wide glass windows of Richard's penthouse overlooking the city skyline. Sophia stood barefoot on the balcony, wrapped in a silk robe, her hair still tousled from sleep. For the first time in years, she felt the dawn bring not dread, but promise. The city stretched out before her like an open book, waiting for her to write her next chapter. She sipped her coffee, replaying the night in her mind. The humiliation Andrew had planned for her had turned into his own undoing. She had walked away not only with dignity, but with her head higher than ever. Yet victory wasn't just about exposing Andrew. It was about rediscovering herself. Richard stepped onto the balcony behind her, his presence grounding her like an anchor. He draped a gentle hand over her shoulder, his voice warm. "How does it feel?" Sophia smiled faintly. "Like breathing after holding my breath for years." "Good," he said. "Because you deserve more than survival. You deserve to live." And live she did. Over the following weeks, Sophia began embracing opportunities she once thought impossible. With Richard's encouragement, but never his interference, she revisited her old dreams. She started writing again, her journal pages filling with words that poured from her soul. She signed up to volunteer at a literacy program for underprivileged teens, discovering that her passion for teaching still burned bright. Word of her strength spread quietly. Old classmates who had witnessed the reunion reached out, some apologizing for staying silent during her darkest years, others offering support. For Sophia, it wasn't about their validation anymore. It was about her reclaiming her voice. Richard admired her resilience, but never tried to overshadow it. At galas and charity events, where cameras flashed and business tycoons shook hands, he introduced her not as his wife, but as Sophia Lane, the woman who inspires me. The words struck deeper than any diamond could. She wasn't someone's accessory. She was someone worth knowing in her own right. Still, there were nights when doubts returned. When she remembered Andrew's cruel words, the years of being dismissed, the moments she had believed she was nothing. Richard never erased those scars. He honored them. "They made you who you are," he told her once, kissing the lines of worry on her forehead. "But they don't define who you'll become." Together, they built a rhythm that balanced power and tenderness. Richard's world of wealth and influence could have been intimidating, but he never used it to cage her. Instead, he gave her freedom to choose, to shine, to explore. And Sophia, slowly, learned to embrace the life she deserved. Not because of Richard's fortune, but because she had earned her own worth. One evening, as they hosted a small charity dinner in their home, Sophia stood at the center of the room, speaking passionately about education for disadvantaged youth. Her voice was steady, her confidence unshakable. The guests listened, moved, some pledging donations on the spot. Richard watched from across the room, pride glowing in his eyes. Later, as the last guest departed, Sophia leaned against the doorframe, exhausted but exhilarated. "Did I do all right?" she asked softly. Richard smiled, pulling her close. "You didn't just do all right, Sophia. You lit the room on fire. That's who you are now." Her chest swelled with quiet pride. This was no longer the life of a woman defined by betrayal. It was the life of a woman who had transformed her pain into purpose. And as Sophia curled against Richard that night, she knew the future was no longer something to fear. It was hers to claim. Andrew Carter had always prided himself on appearances. He believed that as long as he looked the part, sharp suit, confident smile, expensive car, people would believe his success was real. But the illusion that had carried him for years was unraveling faster than he could stitch it back together. The reunion had been the first domino. Sophia's calm, cutting words and the evidence she revealed had shaken the foundations of his carefully crafted facade. Now the aftershocks were spreading everywhere. Within a week, investors began pulling out of his failing company. Contracts he had boasted about securing were suddenly postponed indefinitely. Clients stopped returning calls. The truth was no longer whispered in dark corners. It was splashed across news feeds and business forums. Andrew Carter, drowning in debt. Andrew stormed into his office one morning to find half his staff gone. Desks empty, computers removed. The few employees who remained avoided his gaze. Their loyalty evaporated with their unpaid checks. His assistant, once eager to please, now barely looked up as she handed him a stack of urgent letters. "Final notices," she said flatly. "Creditors, banks, lawyers." His chest tightened. He threw the papers onto his desk, pacing like a trapped animal. "They can't do this to me," he muttered. "I built this company. I made them all money. They owe me." But deep down, he knew it wasn't true. He hadn't built an empire. He had built a house of cards, and Sophia had been the one holding it steady all along. Without her, it had collapsed. And the humiliation didn't end in business. Social circles that once welcomed him now shut their doors. At parties, people turned their backs. At restaurants, whispers followed him like shadows. Even Vanessa, his shining prize, had disappeared from his life entirely. She hadn't returned his calls, and he'd heard rumors she was already on the arm of another man with deeper pockets. The final blow came one evening when Andrew attended a networking gala, desperate to claw back some respect. He arrived in his best tuxedo, forcing a smile, ready to charm his way back into relevance. But as he entered the glittering hall, the conversations dimmed. People didn't rush to greet him. They stepped aside. Some even smirked. Across the room, a group of former classmates from the reunion stood together. One of them, a lawyer, raised his glass with a mocking grin. "Andrew Carter," he called out loudly. "Still pretending to be the king when everyone knows you're already bankrupt." Laughter erupted, cruel and cutting. Andrew's face flushed crimson. He tried to respond, but his throat tightened. Words failed him. The room felt like it was closing in, every eye a spotlight burning into his skin. He stumbled toward the bar, gripping the counter to steady himself. For the first time, he realized that the power he had used to humiliate others had evaporated completely. He was no longer feared, no longer admired. He was a punchline. On the other side of the city, Sophia was at a charity dinner with Richard, her laughter warm, her presence celebrated. Andrew, meanwhile, sat alone in his darkened apartment, staring at the empty glass in his hand. The silence pressed down heavier than any insult. He had lost everything: his company, his reputation, his mistress, and most painfully, the woman who had been his foundation. And as he sat there, bitterness clawing at his chest, one thought haunted him. Sophia had risen while he had fallen, and there was no way back. Weeks after the reunion, Sophia Lane found her life shifting in ways she hadn't imagined. What had started as a night of humiliation turned triumph had now blossomed into something far greater. She was no longer just the woman who survived Andrew Carter's betrayal. She was becoming a voice, a presence, a force of her own. It began subtly. Old classmates started reaching out, not out of pity, but out of admiration. Some wrote messages thanking her for standing up, for showing strength they had longed to see in their own lives. One woman confessed she was in a loveless marriage but had never found the courage to leave. "Your words gave me hope," she wrote. Another admitted he had always dismissed his wife's sacrifices, but seeing Sophia reclaim her dignity had opened his eyes. Sophia read every message carefully, often with tears in her eyes. She realized her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to anyone who had been silenced, belittled, or abandoned. Encouraged by Richard, she accepted an invitation to speak at a local women's conference. Standing on the stage, microphone in hand, Sophia felt her knees tremble just like they had at the reunion. But as she looked out into the faces of women waiting, listening, needing, she knew she couldn't falter. "I am not here because I was broken," she began softly. "I am here because I refuse to stay broken." Her voice steadied as she spoke about betrayal, about survival, about choosing to rise when the world told you to fall. She didn't hide her pain, she shared it. And in that honesty she found power. The applause that followed was thunderous, not because she was flawless, but because she was real. From there, doors opened. Sophia was invited to lead workshops, to mentor young women, to advocate for causes close to her heart. She wasn't trying to become a public figure, but her authenticity drew people in. Newspapers picked up her story, painting her not as the ex-wife of Andrew Carter, but as the woman who turned betrayal into empowerment. Richard watched all of this with quiet pride. At galas, he stood back, letting Sophia shine. At dinners, he listened as others leaned toward her, captivated not by her connection to him, but by her strength, her wisdom, her grace. And each time, she glanced at him with gratitude, knowing he gave her the space to grow, not the cage to shrink. Sophia also returned to her roots. She began a literacy initiative, funding libraries in underfunded schools, mentoring teenage girls who had been told they would never make it far. "Don't let anyone define you," she told them. "Not your mistakes, not your scars, not the voices that say you're not enough." At home, she was still the same Sophia, curling up with a book, laughing with Richard over takeout dinners, writing in her journal late into the night. But the difference was in her reflection. When she looked into the mirror now, she didn't see the hollow, broken woman Andrew had tried to create. She saw a survivor, a leader, a woman finally free. And while Andrew's name faded into bitter gossip, Sophia's name grew into something else entirely. A symbol of resilience. Friends, strangers, and even those who once pitied her now looked at her with respect. One evening, as she closed her laptop after replying to yet another heartfelt message, Richard pulled her into his arms. "Do you realize what you're doing?" he asked. Sophia tilted her head. Curious. "What do you mean?" "You're not just living, Sophia. You're leading. You're lighting the path for people who thought they'd never escape the dark." Sophia smiled softly, her heart swelling with peace. For the first time she understood. Her story wasn't just about survival. It was about giving others the courage to rise too. Andrew Carter had always feared irrelevance more than failure. Failure, he told himself, could be fixed. But irrelevance, the slow erasure of his name from conversations, the absence of respect in people's eyes, that was unbearable. And yet, as the weeks passed after the reunion, irrelevance became his reality. The phone calls stopped first. Investors who once begged for meetings no longer returned his calls. Clients who had once toasted him at expensive dinners now avoided him in public. The silence was suffocating. Each day he sat at his office desk, staring at his phone, willing it to ring. But the only calls that came were from creditors and lawyers. Then came the lawsuits. Former partners dragged him to court for unpaid debts. Employees demanded back wages. The papers reported on his crumbling company with merciless headlines. Andrew Carter, empire exposed as mirage, and from power to ruin, the fall of a local businessman. His face, once a mask of confidence, now stared back from newspapers as a symbol of arrogance gone wrong. The humiliation seeped into every corner of his life. When he walked down the street, whispers followed. "That's him," strangers muttered. "The man who lost everything." Even the doorman at his building, once eager to greet him, now barely nodded, his eyes filled with quiet judgment. And then there was Vanessa. The woman he had sacrificed his marriage for, the one he had paraded like a prize, was gone. She had disappeared into the arms of another man, leaving only a scrawled note on his countertop. "I can't do this. You're sinking, and I won't go down with you." Andrew crumpled the note in his fist, rage boiling inside him. But the truth clawed at his chest. He was sinking, and everyone knew it. Nights grew darker. Alone in his apartment, he drowned himself in whiskey, pacing between unpaid bills and unopened letters. The lavish furniture, once symbols of status, now felt like mockery. He stared at the city lights outside his window, remembering the night of the reunion when Sophia had walked out taller than him. That image haunted him more than any debt collector's call. He replayed her words in his mind. "You thought I was nothing without you, but tonight everyone sees the truth." They cut deeper now than they had in that ballroom. Because she was right, she had risen, he had fallen. One night, drunk and desperate, Andrew stumbled into a bar where a few old classmates were drinking. He tried to join their table, plastering on a smile, but they barely looked at him. One leaned back and said coldly, "Andrew, no one wants to hear your lies anymore." The sting was sharper than any lawsuit. He left the bar humiliated, the laughter behind him echoing like knives. Back in his apartment, Andrew sank into his couch, head in his hands. For the first time in his life, he admitted the truth. Not out loud, not to anyone else but to himself. He had destroyed everything. Not Sophia, not the economy, not bad luck. Him, his arrogance, his cruelty, his choices. And as the clock ticked past midnight, the silence pressed in on him. No Vanessa, no friends, no company, no applause, just emptiness. Andrew Carter, once the man who strutted into a reunion with a mistress on his arm, had become a hollow shell. And as he sat alone staring into the dark, he realized he hadn't just hit rock bottom, he was buried beneath it. For Sophia, life after the reunion felt like sunlight after a storm. She was finally free, finally respected, finally standing on her own 2 feet. But with every new chapter comes a new test, and hers arrived sooner than she expected. It began when an article about her and Richard appeared in a major newspaper. The headline read, "Millionaire CEO's secret wife revealed, Sophia Lane." The story painted her as more than just Richard's partner. It painted her as someone who had married into wealth, someone who had conveniently landed on her feet after divorce. Sophia stared at the article in disbelief, her heart sinking. The photographs were flattering, but the words stung. She was once abandoned, now she basks in the luxury of penthouse living. The writer implied her strength wasn't her own, but borrowed from Richard's fortune. When she stepped outside, the whispers followed. At the grocery store, at the cafe, even at charity events, she felt eyes watching her, judging. "Gold digger," she overheard once, the words slicing through her chest. Richard noticed her silence one evening as they sat across from each other at dinner. "Talk to me," he said gently. Sophia sighed, pushing her plate away. "They think I'm with you because of your money, that everything I've built for myself doesn't matter." Her voice cracked. "After everything I went through to stand on my own, it feels like I'm being erased all over again." Richard leaned forward, his eyes steady. "Sophia, you don't owe the world an explanation. You don't have to prove your worth to people who only see headlines." "But I owe it to myself," she whispered. The tension grew over the next weeks. Invitations to events multiplied, reporters circled like vultures, and Sophia found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never asked for. She wanted to be known for her literacy programs, for her voice, for her strength, not for the man she married. Yet every article seemed to begin with "wife of Richard Hale." One evening, after a particularly harsh column, Sophia broke down. "Maybe I made a mistake," she told Richard, tears welling in her eyes. "Maybe I wasn't ready for this life. Maybe I'll never be seen as more than your accessory." Richard's face hardened, not in anger at her, but at the world that refused to see her truth. He took her hands firmly. Listen to me. You are not my accessory. You are my equal. Everything you've done, your work, your courage, your story, that's yours. If the world can't see it yet, then we'll make them. Together. His conviction steadied her, but the doubt lingered. Could she continue this journey without losing herself again? The answer came at her next public speaking event. She walked onto the stage with her heart pounding, hearing the whispers of, "That's Richard Hale's wife." But when she began to speak about resilience, about scars, about rising from betrayal, the room fell silent. People leaned forward, hanging on her every word. By the end, they weren't applauding Richard's wife. They were applauding Sophia Lane. Backstage, Richard met her with pride shining in his eyes. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "That's for you." Sophia exhaled, the weight lifting from her shoulders. She realized then that their love would always be tested, not because of him, but because of the world's narrow view. But as long as she continued to rise, as long as she never forgot who she was, she would not be erased. And Richard's hand in hers reminded her of one unshakable truth. Together, they were stronger than any whisper, any headline, any storm. Andrew Carter had lost nearly everything. His company, his mistress, his reputation. But bitterness is a stubborn flame. It doesn't die quietly. It burns hotter when surrounded by ashes. And Andrew's bitterness fixated on one target, Sophia. He couldn't stand the headlines praising her resilience. He couldn't stomach the applause that followed her speeches. Each article, each social media post that called her an inspiration felt like a dagger twisting in his pride. He told himself she had humiliated him, destroyed him, left him to rot while she basked in the glory. And in his mind, there was only one solution: take her down with him. One rainy evening, Andrew sat hunched over his cluttered apartment desk, empty bottles scattered around him, his laptop glowing with the seed of his revenge. He drafted an anonymous email to several tabloids, filled with lies. He claimed Sophia had manipulated Richard into marrying her, that she had schemed her way into wealth, that she was nothing but a con artist. He even forged documents to back up his story, desperate to make the world believe she was a fraud. The next morning, the headlines appeared. Sophia Lane, inspirational figure or gold-digging opportunist? The articles spread like wildfire. Online forums buzzed with speculation. Strangers who had once applauded her began to question her. For Sophia, waking up to those words felt like stepping back into her darkest nightmare. She sat at the breakfast table, the newspaper trembling in her hands. "It's happening again," she whispered to Richard. "They're painting me as nothing, just like he used to." Richard took the paper from her, his jaw tightening. "This is desperation, Sophia. Lies don't last when truth stands taller. We'll fight this." But the damage was real. Invitations to events were postponed. Sponsors for her literacy initiative hesitated. People who had once praised her now sent cautious emails, asking for clarification. Sophia felt the old wound reopening, the voice in her head whispering that Andrew had been right all along. For 2 days, she withdrew. She avoided calls, avoided the mirror, avoided the world. Richard tried to reach her, but she was lost in her own silence. Then on the 3rd day, something shifted. A package arrived at their door, an envelope filled with supportive letters from women she had inspired. One note read, "You gave me the courage to leave an abusive marriage. Don't let him take your voice away." Sophia's hands shook as she read, tears welling in her eyes. She looked at Richard, determination flickering through the pain. No, he doesn't get to win again. Not this time. They called a press conference. Cameras flashed as Sophia stood at the podium, sat Richard by her side. Her voice trembled at first, but grew stronger with every word. "Yes, I was abandoned. Yes, I was humiliated. But I rebuilt myself. Not through money, not through manipulation, but through resilience. These lies are the desperate attempt of a man who cannot accept responsibility for his own downfall. I will not be silenced again." The room erupted in applause. Reporters asked questions, but Sophia's calm, unshaken stance made the truth clear. The forged documents Andrew had created unraveled under scrutiny within days, exposed by experts as fraudulent. The same tabloids that had doubted her now ran stories about Andrew's desperate scheme. And once again, Andrew's plan backfired. He became a laughingstock, branded not only as bankrupt, but as a liar clinging to the last threads of relevance. Sophia, on the other hand, stood taller than ever. Andrew's last strike had not destroyed her. it had only proven her strength. Sophia Lane had endured storms most people couldn't imagine. Betrayal, public humiliation, lies spread like wildfire. And yet, through every attempt to break her, she rose higher. By the time Andrew's desperate scheme collapsed under the weight of its own deceit, Sophia wasn't just surviving, she was soaring. Her literacy initiative exploded in popularity. Donations poured in, not because of pity, but because people believed in her mission. She appeared on morning shows, not as the ex-wife of Andrew Carter, but as a leader fighting for education and empowerment. Her speeches were shared online, clips going viral with comments like, "She gives me hope," and "This is what resilience looks like." One afternoon, she stood in a community center, surrounded by teenagers holding books they never would have owned without her program. Their eyes sparkled with gratitude, their laughter filled the room. Sophia crouched beside a girl clutching a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The girl whispered, "I didn't think anyone cared about kids like us until you came." Sophia's throat tightened. In that moment, she realized her triumph wasn't the applause of crowds or the headlines praising her. It was this. It was giving back. It was proving to herself that she was more than the scars Andrew left behind. Recognition followed naturally. Universities invited her to speak. Nonprofit organizations asked her to sit on their boards. At one gala, she was honored with an award for excellence in community leadership. The applause echoed in her ears as she accepted, Richard watching proudly from the front row. But when she stepped up to the microphone, she didn't speak of awards or accomplishments. "I was once told I was nothing," she began, her voice clear and steady. "That I would never stand without someone else holding me up. But here's what I learned. Our worth isn't defined by those who betray us. It's defined by how we rise after the fall. Tonight, I stand here not because I was never broken, but because I refused to stay broken." The crowd rose to its feet, clapping until the walls shook. Sophia held back tears, humbled by how far she had come. Richard met her backstage afterward, wrapping her in his arms. "You've become everything he tried to convince you you weren't," he whispered. Sophia smiled, resting her head against his chest. "Not everything, Richard, more." In the quiet of their home later that night, Sophia reflected in her journal. She didn't write about Andrew anymore. He was no longer a shadow in her story. Instead, she wrote about hope, about healing, about the future she was building with Richard, and the lives she was touching through her work. The city skyline glowed outside the window, and for the first time she felt not like a survivor, but like a victor. Her scars had not disappeared, but they had transformed into symbols of strength. The woman who once cowered under Andrew's cruelty now stood tall, her legacy stretching far beyond her own pain. And somewhere in the darkness of the city, Andrew sat alone, forgotten, irrelevant. His name no longer carried weight. His story no longer mattered. Sophia's story did. Her triumph was not revenge, it was freedom. It was the joy of living on her own terms, of proving that betrayal could never define her. And as she closed her journal for the night, she knew one truth with absolute certainty. Her greatest victory was not just surviving Andrew, it was becoming the woman she was always meant to be. Andrew Carter had once imagined himself untouchable. The man with the expensive suits, the confident grin, the mistress on his arm. The man who believed he could walk into any room and own it. But months after the reunion, those illusions had been stripped away one by one, leaving him hollow, bitter, and utterly alone. His company was gone. The last of his assets had been liquidated to pay off debts he could never fully cover. He no longer had an office to command or employees to bark orders at. The sleek car he once flaunted was repossessed. The penthouse he bragged about stood empty after foreclosure notices forced him out. Now he lived in a cramped apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place he used to mock. The wallpaper peeled, the faucet leaked, and the walls smelled faintly of mildew. Every night he fell asleep to the sound of sirens outside his window, a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. And worse than the loss of wealth was the loss of respect. Friends he once entertained at lavish dinners no longer answered his calls. Old classmates who once tolerated his arrogance now mocked him openly. Even strangers who recognized his face whispered in disdain, "That's the man who tried to ruin her." Vanessa, the mistress he had once paraded like a prize, had vanished months ago. Word spread that she was happily flaunting her new relationship with a wealthy real estate developer, a man who actually had money. She hadn't left Andrew with so much as a goodbye, just silence. Andrew's pride refused to die quietly. At first, he tried to claw his way back, pitching half-baked business ideas to anyone who would listen. But no one did. Every door slammed in his face, every opportunity dissolved the moment his name was mentioned. His reputation was poisoned beyond repair. One evening, desperate and drunk, he wandered into a bar. The same bar where years earlier he had laughed with clients, celebrating victories that now felt like lies. This time he sat alone, his suit wrinkled, his tie stained. A group of men nearby recognized him and burst into laughter. "Hey, Carter," one of them jeered. "Where's your fancy watch? Pawn it yet?" Andrew clenched his fists, but the fight had long drained from him. He lowered his head, swallowing the humiliation like poison. He knew he deserved it, but knowing didn't dull the sting. As the weeks dragged on, Andrew's world shrank further. He stopped answering calls altogether. Not that many came. He stopped leaving his apartment except for cheap liquor and groceries. The mirror reflected a man he didn't recognize. Haggard, unshaven, eyes hollow. Sometimes, late at night, he replayed Sophia's words from the reunion in his mind. "You thought I was nothing without you, but tonight, everyone sees the truth." He had scoffed then, but now those words echoed like a curse. She had risen higher than ever, while he had sunk to depths he couldn't have imagined. His defeat wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was slow, suffocating, the kind of downfall that left him invisible, forgotten. A man who once demanded the spotlight now sat in the shadows, irrelevant to the world he once tried to dominate. And in his rare moments of clarity, Andrew admitted the truth he had buried for so long. Sophia hadn't destroyed him. He had destroyed himself. His arrogance, his greed, his cruelty, those had been the real enemies. But the realization came too late. Andrew Carter's story ended not in triumph, not in redemption, but in silence, while Sophia's name continued to rise, leaving him behind in the darkness of his own making. The city glowed beneath a golden sunset as Sophia Lane stood on the balcony of her home, the skyline stretching out like a canvas of possibility. Months had passed since the reunion, months since Andrew's last desperate attempt to ruin her had collapsed. The scars of her past still lingered, but they no longer defined her. They were reminders, proof of battles fought and survived. Richard joined her, slipping an arm gently around her waist. "Thinking again?" he teased softly. Sophia smiled. "Always. But this time it's not about the past. It's about what comes next." What came next was more than she had ever dreamed. Her literacy program had expanded into 3 cities, reaching hundreds of children who once had no access to books. Her story continued to inspire, not because of the scandal she endured, but because of the strength she had chosen. She had become a voice not of bitterness but of healing. And healing was what mattered most. She no longer replayed Andrew's betrayal in her mind. She no longer feared whispers or pitying glances. Those things had faded, replaced by applause, respect, and something deeper: self-love. For years, she had begged for validation from someone who only tore her down. Now, she validated herself. One afternoon, Sophia was invited back to her old high school to speak. Standing in the same auditorium where she had once sat as a teenager, she looked out at rows of bright young faces. She told them not about wealth or power, but about resilience. "Life will test you," she said, her voice strong. "People may betray you, some may tell you that you are not enough. But remember, your worth is not theirs to define, it is yours to claim." The students rose to their feet, clapping, some with tears in their eyes. Sophia walked off the stage knowing this was her true legacy, not just what she built, but what she gave to others. That night, back at home, she curled up on the couch with Richard. They didn't need to talk about Andrew anymore. His name had faded from the headlines, his presence erased from her story. Where once he was the storm that consumed her, now he was nothing more than a shadow in her rearview mirror. Richard brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked carefully. Sophia shook her head. "Not with anger. Not anymore. I think of him as a lesson, a reminder of who I never want to be and of how far I've come. He didn't break me. He shaped me. And for that, oddly enough, I'm grateful." Richard kissed her forehead, pride shining in his eyes. That's strength, Sophia. Real strength. The two sat in silence, the city lights twinkling outside, their hands entwined. Sophia felt peace in her chest, a peace she once thought impossible. She had not only survived, she had transformed. Her story was no longer one of betrayal, it was one of rebirth. A reminder that even when the world tries to break you, even when you are cast aside, you can rise, you can heal, you can write a new ending. And as Sophia Lane leaned into Richard's embrace, she smiled with the certainty that her ending wasn't just happy, it was powerful. Her life was no longer defined by being the ex-wife of Andrew Carter. It was defined by being Sophia, the woman who rose, who inspired, and who would never be silenced again. So that's how the story comes to an end. And if you're still here with me right now, my wonderful friends, it probably means something in this story touched your heart in a way you can't quite explain. Maybe you've been through betrayal, maybe you've been overlooked, or maybe you felt like your worth was measured by someone else's opinion. If so, Sophia's journey is a reminder that those voices don't define you. The Stoics often said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." Marcus Aurelius reminded us that the obstacle is often the way. Sophia's pain was real, but her healing came when she stopped replaying Andrew's cruelty in her mind and chose instead to rise. That's a lesson for all of us. The past cannot chain us unless we allow it. We can't control what others do to us, but we can always control how we rise afterward. So let Sophia's story remind you of this. Your scars don't mean you're broken. They mean you survived. They mean you are stronger than the storm that tried to destroy you. And if this story gave you even a spark of courage, do me a favor. Hit the like button, share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next story. Because just like Sophia, you too can write a new ending. The reunion hall glittered with chandeliers, polished marble floors, and laughter echoing across the room. Old classmates hugged, clinking glasses, sharing memories of youth as though time had never touched them. But among the crowd, one entrance shifted the entire atmosphere. Andrew Carter strutted in, his tuxedo pressed, his arm tightly wrapped around a woman half his age. She was stunning in a red silk dress, her long legs gliding across the floor like she owned the night. Her name was Vanessa, the very mistress who had destroyed his marriage. The whispers began immediately. "Isn't that Andrew? And who's that with him?" Another voice, sharper, replied, "That's not Sophia. Where's his wife?" Andrew smirked, loving the attention, feeding off the shock in the room. For him, tonight wasn't about reconnecting with classmates. It was about revenge. He had spent weeks planning this grand appearance, rehearsing how he would flaunt Vanessa, how he would humiliate the woman who once stood by his side through every struggle. His ex-wife, Sophia Lane, had given him years of devotion. She had built a home, sacrificed her career, and endured every insult. Yet, in his eyes, she was disposable. Tonight, he intended to remind her of it in front of everyone they had ever known. The doors at the far end opened again, quietly at first. A hush fell as heads turned, and there she was. Sophia Lane stepped into the reunion, her simple navy dress hugging her figure with quiet elegance. Her hair was swept back, her smile warm but cautious. She had been dreading this night, but she had promised herself she would not hide forever. For too long she had carried the shame Andrew dumped on her. For too long she had allowed others to believe she was the weak, abandoned woman left in ruins. But tonight she came to face it. Andrew's voice rang out across the hall, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, look who decided to show up," he sneered, raising his glass with mock celebration. Vanessa laughed, her eyes sweeping Sophia from head to toe with cruel amusement. The room shifted, some guests averting their gaze out of pity, others whispering with curiosity. Sophia's chest tightened. Every instinct told her to turn around, to run. But she took a deep breath and walked forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, echoing louder than her pounding heart. Andrew leaned closer to Vanessa, his smirk growing crueler. "Watch this," he muttered, preparing to humiliate Sophia in front of everyone. But what Andrew didn't know was that this night would not unfold according to his plan. There was someone else already watching, someone powerful, someone who had promised Sophia she would never stand alone again. and in a matter of minutes, Andrew's smug grin would be wiped clean from his face forever. Sophia Lane had not always been the woman who walked into that glittering reunion hall with trembling resolve. Once upon a time, she was simply a small-town girl, with dreams stitched together by books and quiet afternoons. She had been a literature teacher at a modest high school, the kind of woman who loved stories, who believed in love the way fairy tales promised. Her laughter was soft, her heart generous, and her trust unwavering. But life has a way of punishing those who believe too deeply in happy endings. At 24, she met Andrew Carter, the man who would change everything. He wasn't rich, not then. He was ambitious, cocky, always talking about how he would climb higher, how the world would one day bow to him. Sophia fell for that fire, mistaking arrogance for confidence. He made her feel chosen, special, like she was part of something greater. They married within 2 years, and Sophia gave up her own graduate studies to support him. She cooked, she budgeted, she encouraged, and she believed. But the cracks came fast. Andrew's sharp tongue grew sharper whenever money was tight. His late nights at the office grew longer, his excuses thinner. Sophia clung to the hope that marriage was sacrifice, that patience would one day be rewarded. Instead, she found herself shrinking, becoming invisible in her own life. Friends drifted away. Her voice softened to keep the peace. She smiled when she wanted to scream, and every time Andrew whispered that she was lucky to have him, a part of her heart quietly broke. The final blow came the night she discovered Vanessa. It wasn't subtle. A message on his phone, perfume lingering on his jacket, his casual dismissal when confronted. "Don't be dramatic, Sophia," he had scoffed, his eyes cold. "Vanessa understands me in ways you never did. Maybe if you had been more, I wouldn't meet her." Those words carved into her soul. For weeks after, she cried herself to sleep, staring at the ceiling of the house she once thought was their forever home. She begged him to reconsider, not because she still loved him, but because she couldn't imagine starting over with nothing. But Andrew didn't reconsider. He left her with empty bank accounts, a broken heart, and whispers behind her back. Their divorce became a spectacle in their small community. Andrew parading Vanessa as proof that he had upgraded. Sophia retreated from the world, nursing her wounds in silence. She took tutoring jobs, lived in a small rented apartment, and avoided reunions, weddings, and parties where pitying glances might follow her. And yet, beneath that pain, a quiet ember still glowed. Sophia was not built to stay broken. She read books about resilience. She journaled late into the night. She forced herself to believe that her story was not finished. Then, fate intervened in the most unexpected way. It happened at a local charity event, one she almost didn't attend. She wore a simple dress, carried a second-hand purse, and tried to blend into the background. That's when she met Richard Hale. Tall, composed, with eyes that saw more than the surface, Richard treated her not as the discarded wife of Andrew Carter, but as a woman of worth. Their first conversation was brief, but the spark was undeniable. He asked questions no one else cared to ask anymore. What did she dream of? What books did she love? What future did she want, not what she had lost? For the first time in years, Sophia felt seen. Not as a victim, not as a failure, but as herself. That night marked the beginning of a transformation no one, not Andrew, not Vanessa, not even Sophia herself, could have imagined. And at the reunion, that transformation was about to step fully into the light, shocking everyone who thought she would remain broken forever. The reunion had been planned for months, but no one expected it to carry the weight of scandal that night. The grand ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel was chosen as the venue, a place dripping with elegance and prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light across the polished marble floors, and waiters in crisp white uniforms glided between tables carrying trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air was thick with perfume, laughter, and the echoes of old friendships reignited after years apart. Every corner of the hall shimmered with wealth. Alumni who had once shared peanut butter sandwiches in the cafeteria now wore designer suits and sparkling gowns. The reunion committee had gone all out, arranging a live jazz band in the corner, a photo booth lined with velvet curtains, and a projection screen looping old yearbook pictures. Nostalgia was meant to fill the evening, but beneath the polished surface lingered an undercurrent of rivalry and curiosity. Everyone wanted to know who had aged well, who had fallen, and who had triumphed. Andrew Carter thrived in this environment. He strutted through the room like a man who still believed he was king of the class. He shook hands too firmly, laughed too loudly, and bragged too shamelessly. Beside him, Vanessa clung to his arm, her red gown deliberately scandalous, her smirk sharp as a blade. Together they fed off the attention, whispering biting comments about others as though they were untouchable. For Andrew, this night was not about friendship. It was about spectacle. And the star he wanted to crush underfoot was his ex-wife. The anticipation for Sophia's arrival was palpable. Whispers circulated before she even stepped inside. "Do you think she'll come?" one woman asked, adjusting her diamond bracelet. "I heard she's been struggling," another voice replied with a pitying tone. In Andrew's corner, he grinned wickedly. "Of course she'll come," he told Vanessa. "She can't resist seeing how far I've climbed without her. She'll look small next to us. Just wait." Then the doors opened. Sophia Lane entered quietly, her presence like a ripple across still water. The music seemed to soften, conversations faltered, and eyes shifted toward her. She didn't wear the flashiest gown or the most expensive jewels, but her calm grace drew attention more powerfully than any diamond. She held her head high, her steps steady, though her heart pounded with every eye on her. This was the battlefield she had feared, yet also the one she had prepared for. The room buzzed with reactions. Some smiled warmly, glad to see her after so long. Others exchanged whispers, remembering the scandal of her divorce. Andrew wasted no time. He raised his glass theatrically and called out across the hall, "Well, well, the forgotten wife arrives at last." Laughter rippled from a few corners, mostly those who feared his sharp tongue. Vanessa leaned in, her voice carrying just enough. "I almost didn't recognize her. She looks tired, doesn't she?" Sophia's cheeks burned, but she didn't falter. She moved through the crowd, offering polite smiles, exchanging greetings, ignoring the sting of whispers. Her focus was survival, not surrender. The hotel's grandeur seemed both comforting and suffocating, a stage where her dignity was being tested under the brightest lights. The irony of the evening was cruel. The reunion was meant to celebrate shared history, but for Sophia, it was becoming a trial by fire. Still, she refused to bow her head. Deep inside, she knew something Andrew could never imagine. This night would not end with her humiliation. The very walls of this glittering ballroom would soon witness a reversal no one saw coming. And the man who thought he controlled the stage would soon realize the spotlight was about to shift in the most shocking way. Andrew Carter had always believed he was destined to dominate every room he entered. From high school days, when he was the loudest voice in class, to his years in business, he carried himself as if the universe owed him recognition. Tonight, at the reunion, he wore that arrogance like a crown. His tuxedo was tailored to perfection, but it was his smirk, the one that said "I won," that completed the performance. On his arm, Vanessa Brooks gleamed like a trophy he couldn't wait to show off. Vanessa was the kind of woman who thrived on attention. 26 years old, with curves wrapped in scarlet silk and lips painted to match, she basked in every jealous glance. She had rehearsed this role in her mind, the younger, shinier partner who had replaced the boring wife. Every laugh she let out was exaggerated, every glance at Andrew was dripping with mock devotion, and every smirk in Sophia's direction was sharpened to wound. Andrew's friends, or rather the people who still tolerated him, circled around with polite smiles. He bragged loudly about his successes, glossing over the debts piling in his failing company. To anyone listening closely, the cracks in his empire were obvious. But tonight wasn't about reality, it was about illusion. He wanted to prove that he had traded up, that Sophia had been nothing more than a stepping stone. "See her over there?" Andrew leaned close to one of his classmates, nodding towards Sophia as she greeted a group of women. "That's my ex-wife. Poor thing. She thought teaching poetry would get us somewhere in life. No ambition, no vision. Look at her now, alone." His voice dripped with contempt, but his eyes flicked nervously, watching for her reaction. Vanessa added fuel to his fire. "Honestly, Andrew, you were too generous. Some women just aren't built to keep up with men of power. But don't worry, baby, you've got me now." She pressed a kiss to his cheek, making sure Sophia saw. It was a performance, every gesture choreographed to humiliate. The crowd around them shifted uncomfortably. Some guests whispered behind raised glasses. Others exchanged knowing looks. A few even pitied Sophia, though no one dared confront Andrew directly. He thrived on their silence, mistaking it for validation. Andrew strutted toward Sophia, pulling Vanessa along. His voice rose above the music, deliberately loud. "Well, Sophia, long time no see. How's the single life treating you?" His grin widened as he glanced at Vanessa, then back at Sophia. "I guess some people just aren't cut out for the good life." Vanessa's laughter rang like glass shattering, echoing through the ballroom. She leaned forward, her eyes glinting with malice. "Oh, Andrew, don't tease her too much. She looks like she's trying so hard to keep it together. Isn't that sweet?" Sophia's fingers tightened around her clutch, her pulse racing. The sting of their cruelty pressed against her ribs like a vice. She wanted to respond, to lash out, but years of being silenced had trained her to swallow the pain. Still, a flicker of defiance burned behind her eyes. What Andrew and Vanessa didn't know was that this reunion wasn't the stage for their triumph. It was the stage for their downfall. Every mocking word, every cruel laugh, every smug display was only setting the trap tighter around them. For now, Sophia held her tongue, letting them believe they had the upper hand. The ballroom buzzed with anticipation, classmates sensing that something monumental was brewing beneath the glittering chandeliers. And in the shadows, a figure watched, silent but poised to change the course of the evening. Andrew thought he was humiliating Sophia, but soon the entire room would see who truly held the power. The moment everyone had dreaded, and some had secretly anticipated, arrived when Andrew decided to put on his cruelest performance yet. The ballroom was buzzing, champagne glasses clinking, the band playing a soft jazz number. Sophia had managed to keep her composure, exchanging polite words with old classmates, though her heart trembled beneath the surface. But Andrew wasn't satisfied with quiet humiliation. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted to crush her spirit in front of every familiar face. He tightened his grip on Vanessa's hand and strode toward the stage at the front of the ballroom. Grabbing the microphone meant for announcements, he tapped it twice, sending sharp feedback through the speakers. The chatter hushed. All eyes turned toward him. Sophia froze where she stood, a cold wave of dread sweeping through her veins. She knew that look on his face. It was the same look he had worn in the courtroom during their divorce. Hungry, triumphant, merciless. "Ladies and gentlemen," Andrew began, his voice smooth but laced with poison, "I'd like to take a moment to celebrate progress." He gestured to Vanessa beside him, her crimson gown glowing under the lights. "You see, life is about moving forward, about choosing the right partner who can keep up with you. And I am lucky enough to say I've found that." The crowd shifted uneasily. Some clapped politely, others exchanged questioning glances. Vanessa leaned against him, smiling with feigned sweetness, though her eyes darted straight to Sophia, gleaming with spite. "But not everyone is so fortunate," Andrew continued, his smile widening into a blade. "Some people get left behind. They can't adapt, can't grow, can't offer more than mediocrity. And when that happens, well..." He paused for dramatic effect, letting silence fill the hall. "You upgrade." Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Sophia's cheeks burned as dozens of eyes turned toward her. Andrew didn't even bother disguising his target. He wanted her humiliation to be public, undeniable. He raised his glass high. To moving on, to better women, better futures, and leaving the past where it belongs, behind us. Laughter broke out from a few corners, hesitant but cruel. Vanessa clinked her glass against his, her giggle ringing like a knife slicing through the air. Sophia's knees trembled. The room blurred for a moment, her breath catching as shame wrapped around her like chains. She wanted to scream, to throw the glass in her hand, to vanish. But she stood still, her nails digging into her palm, forcing herself not to break in front of them. A friend from high school reached toward her gently. "Sophia, ignore him," she whispered, but Sophia could hardly hear over the roar in her ears. Memories of nights crying alone, of Andrew's cutting words, of signing away her home, all of it came rushing back like a storm. Andrew, drunk on his own cruelty, wasn't finished. "Look at her, everyone," he said, gesturing openly. Still trying to smile, still pretending. "You know what they say, some women just can't survive without a man to carry them." The ballroom fell into a stunned silence. No one dared move. Even those who despised Andrew were too afraid to intervene. Sophia's vision blurred with tears, but behind the pain was a spark of fire. She held her head higher, refusing to give him the breakdown he wanted. Andrew smirked, satisfied, believing he had destroyed her completely. What he didn't realize was that his performance had crossed a line. He had gone too far, and the crowd's sympathy was shifting. More importantly, he had awakened something in Sophia she thought was long dead. And within moments, the humiliation he crafted for her would begin to turn into the trap that consumed him instead.